The town hall felt like a trap dressed as a celebration, and the first slide burned. Nora Hayes said, "That file isn't mine," but the mic distorted her voice into a tremor. Eli Turner said, "Breathe," and his calm cut through the murmurs like a scalpel. Victor Lang smiled with the smoothness of polished chrome and pointed at charts that recast Nora's diligence as fraud. Shame scalded her skin while screens showed false timestamps and forged approvals. She tasted copper and remembered every time she chose silence to survive. Nora said, "You know I didn't do this," and Victor said, "The data is clear." The room smelled like burnt coffee and fear, and colleagues watched as if justice were a sport. Eli said, "Stand tall," and the words steadied her spine. She felt her father's gravel hands on hers from years ago saying, "Be a rock, the river splits around." Nora said, "I want to see the audit trail." Victor blinked, then laughed too quickly. The laugh told her the truth had a pulse. She straightened her badge and faced the screen. Nora said, "I won't carry your lie," and the room finally listened. The hall emptied like a tide withdrawing, and Nora felt the sting of 1,000 unasked questions. Eli said, "You don't owe them your shame," and the words pressed gentleness against a bruise. She remembered the years of staying small so storms would pass over her head. Nora said, "He planned this," and the thought glinted like a buried nail. The forged timestamps echoed with the rhythm of someone confident in shadows. Eli said, "We trace the trail and make it plain," and his certainty steadied her bones. She pictured her mother counting tips beside a flickering lamp and promising that honesty was armor. Nora said, "Armor is loud when struck," and her voice surprised her. She opened her laptop at a quiet bench and pulled logs, cache fragments, and access history. Doubt tried to creep in like fog, but she set a timer and focused on one verifiable thing. Eli said small facts build big walls, and she nodded. She decided to confront fear with craft, and the decision felt like breath after deep water. The first breadcrumb was a mismatch between server time and badge swipe logs that should never disagree. Nora said, "If clocks fight," someone twisted one, and she marked the delta in red. Eli said, "Who benefits from the gap?" and the question wound like wire around the evidence. She checked audit entries and found a login routed through a maintenance subnet that no analyst used. Nora said, "Ghost door," and screens bloomed with trace routes. She felt the thrill of competence overriding shame, a clean flame in a cold room. Eli said, "Keep it replicable," and she exported steps into a plain text doc. She heard Victor's laugh again and measured her breath to quiet the sound. Nora said, "We need the change approvals," and she queued a request with precise citations. The building groaned as the air system switched to night mode. Eli said, "You're doing it," and the praise landed like a hand on a railing in the dark. She smiled without softness and kept digging. By 2 a.m., the pattern resolved into something ugly and precise. Nora said, "Victor signed a decommission that redirected logs," and the sentence tasted like iron. Eli said, "Chain of custody," and she mapped every hop from request to outcome with timestamps. She caught a secondary signature from an unexpected account that belonged to facilities. Nora said, "They used a badge that never leaves a drawer," and the drawer voiced a name in her head. Panic tapped knuckles against her ribs, but she answered with procedure. Eli said, "Document motive last," and she pushed speculation aside. She exported a clean packet of reproducible evidence and hashed it with a checksum. Nora said, "I don't want revenge, just truth," and the truth looked back like a mirror finally wiped. The shame that had flooded the hall felt thinner now, like smoke after rain. Eli said, "Tomorrow, you ask for an independent review," and she nodded, already drafting the request. Dawn colored the city with a tired gold, and Nora felt the ground return under her feet. She printed the packet and slid it into a labeled folder like a craftsman packing tools. Nora said, "I'll request the review and insist on chain integrity," and her voice carried a new center. Eli said, "When he laughs, let it pass like weather," and the advice settled warm. She thought of her neighborhood, of windows where people learned to be small, and she chose to stand full height. Nora said, "No grand speeches, just facts," and she pictured the room hearing her without the sting of accusation. They walked toward compliance as lights blinked awake across cubicles. Eli said, "You're not alone," and the words wrapped her like a quiet coat. The fear was still there, but it obeyed her now. Nora said, "I'm ready," and the day opened like a door that had always been unlocked. Morning found Nora at her kitchen table, and the cheap laminate held the dents of years that taught her to endure. Nora said, "I used to whisper to survive," and the kettle hissed like a held breath. She remembered her mother counting tips, the clatter of coins steady as rain on a tin roof. Nora said, she called honesty armor, and the memory fit like a coat 2 sizes small. Outside buses sighed and a siren thinned into distance, and the city felt like a stern mentor. Eli said, "Armor still needs a stance," over the phone, and the line crackled with warmth. She touched the folder and felt how paper can weigh like iron when truth lives inside. Nora said, "I won't prove my worth by bleeding," and the words startled her with their shape. She ate toast like a ritual to reject panic and choose craft. Eli said, "Slow is smooth, smooth is fast," and she laughed, because discipline sounded like mercy. She packed her bag and locked the door, and the morning unlocked something in her. The neighborhood woke with the smell of laundry soap and fried dough, and Nora walked the block that raised her. Nora said, "I learned to be invisible here," and the storefront glass reflected a smaller self. A teen held a door for an elder, and the gesture threaded dignity into the morning. Nora said, "Worth isn't noise," and she kept pace with the beat of rolling gates. She thought of nights she chose silence, so rent came on time and tempers cooled. Eli said, "You're not noise. You're a note that holds," through a text that pinged like a bell. She looked up at a weathered mural of hands lifting a sun, and her spine matched its arc. Nora said, "I will walk inside the light even if I still tremble," and the tremble did not win. A bus growled past, and the rush of grit felt like a scrub on old shame. She turned toward the office and let the block bless her with its ordinary grace. The day waited, and she chose to meet it standing. Compliance sat behind frosted glass like a polite fortress, and Nora asked for the independent review. Nora said, "Chain integrity is preserved here," and handed the packet with palms that did not shake. The officer scanned the pages, eyelids flicking like metronomes. Eli said, "Facts, not fireworks," in her ear, and she breathed once for rhythm. She cited timestamps, checksums, and the maintenance subnet like a map she could walk blind. Nora said, "I request temporary access controls," and the request landed with clean city weight. The officer nodded and penciled notes, and bureaucracy felt less like tide and more like tool. Nora said, "I will answer questions in writing," and her voice held even terrain. She signed forms and kept her shoulders unbowed as fluorescent hum stitched the silence. Eli said, "You're building the road under your feet," and she believed him. She stepped out lighter, not because it was over, but because she was no longer afraid of beginning. In the cafeteria's back corner, Eli slid into the booth with the posture of someone who carries storms quietly. Eli said, "You did clean work," and the praise hit like a steady drum. Nora said, "I still hear his laugh," and the sound tried to stain the air. Eli said, "Let it be weather," and he sketched a next step plan on a napkin like a field diagram. They listed potential allies and neutral parties who respected process more than power. Nora said, "I'll ask Patras to witness the handoff," and the name felt like leverage. Eli said, "Document who touches the truth," and his bluntness made room for breath. She remembered the mural and the held sun, and matched her tone to its brightness. Nora said, "I want a culture where silence isn't the price of staying," and it rang true. Eli said, "Then act as if it already exists," and the future felt nearer. They stood, and the napkin plan folded into her pocket like a small, sharp tool. Afternoon dimmed into a thin gray, and Nora walked to the records room with measured steps. Nora said, I'm not here to win. I'm here to witness. And the sentence unlocked patience. Patris met her at the door, steady as a level line. Patris said, "We'll do this by the book," and the promise steadied the ground. Nora handed the packet for official logging, and the timestamp printed like a verdict. Eli said, "Take a photo of the receipt," and she did, because small proofs become anchors. Nora said, "Thank you for witnessing," and the gratitude was not decoration, it was framework. The room smelled like paper and cold air, and the hum sounded almost like a hymn. Patris said, "Truth doesn't need a parade," and Nora smiled because dignity had volume. She left the room with nothing grand in her hands, and everything essential in motion. The hallway felt wider, and her step kept time with something brighter than fear. The email hit at 9 a.m., and the subject line cut like glass. Nora said, "Administrative leave," and the words tasted metallic. Har framed it as neutrality, but the hallway carried a verdict. Eli said, "Hold your center," and the phrase steadied her breath. Her badge still opened doors, yet eyes closed when she passed. A chat thread pinged with half-truths that multiplied like gnats. Nora said, "Truth walks slower than rumor," and she chose to walk anyway. Victor surfaced at the end of the corridor with a lawyer's smile. He said, "Let the process work," and the tone made process sound like a leash. Patris messaged that a counterparty had challenged the chain of custody. Nora said, "Then we double the audit," and logged each step with stubborn grace. Fear threw sparks, but none found tinder. Eli said, "Your work is the anchor," and she gripped that sentence like a rail. The lift doors opened, and she stepped in without shrinking from the mirrored walls. Outside, rain stitched the city into a single gray sheet, and Nora walked to keep from shaking. Nora said, "I will not borrow fear from the future," and the sentence warmed her ribs. A call from home landed with clattering concern. Her aunt said, "Quit before they break you," and love wore a helmet of worry. Eli said, "You're not flammable by text," and she smiled at the blunt mercy. She bought coffee she did not need, and let the heat lecture her hands. Nora said, "Discipline over drama," and she opened her notes on a bus shelter bench. She listed facts like stones in a riverbed, each one weight and path. The storm softened, and the city smelled rinsed. A colleague walked by and looked away, and the flinch did not wound her. Nora said, "Their silence is not my measure," and the rain consented by easing. She stood, folded her list, and felt the floor of her self-hold. By noon, Patris flagged a motion from legal that questioned Nora's access notes. Patris said, "They want to limit your terminals," and procedure felt like a narrowing throat. Victor's team filed a memo that called her documentation argumentative. Nora said, "Precision is not aggression," and the words carried clean edges. Eli said, "Answer with clarity, not heat," and she trimmed her draft until it clicked. An anonymous tip arrived inside compliance with a single line. It read, "Maintenance subnet created after hours by facilities under Victor's directive." Nora said, "Signal or bait," and she traced the claim without touching opinion. She requested the maintenance roster for the night in question. The request placed a light on a door someone wanted kept dark. Eli said, "Name the door, don't kick it," and she agreed. She signed the revised statement with a steady hand, and sent it like an arrow. The escalation arrived as a calendar invite titled "Courtesy Discussion." Nora said, "A velvet glove," and entered the room with even shoulders. Victor waited with a compliance liaison and a corporate communications lead. He said, "We all want alignment," and the word rattled like loose change. They suggested she pause external contact with witnesses. Nora said, "I will follow documented policy only," and the sentence rang clean. The liaison asked for courtesy summaries after each step. Eli said, "Courtesy can be a net," and she logged the ask verbatim. Victor smiled when she refused to concede language that blurred responsibility. Nora said, "Precision protects everyone," and the liaison nodded because truth wears good shoes. The meeting ended without promises, which counted as a win. She left with notes that could stand alone in daylight. Evening found Nora at a quiet stairwell, and the concrete steps felt older than rumor. She read her statement once more, and saw no heat, only spine. Nora said, "I choose the steadiness that makes panic bored," and the echo approved. Eli said, "Your calm is loud," and the praise landed like a key. She practiced answers aloud, short and exact, as if carving. The fear returned, smaller and housebroken. Nora said, "Let the facts do the shouting," and the words settled like bricks. She remembered the mural hands, and pictured them holding her evidence high. The storm had passed, leaving a city rinsed and new. She promised herself one unbroken night of sleep as fuel, not escape. Eli said, "Tomorrow is a bridge you've already built," and she believed him. She closed her eyes and let quiet do its work. When she stood, the stairwell felt like a runway. The independent review team arrived with clipboards and neutral smiles, and the air in the boardroom thickened. Nora said, "Facts not faces," and laid out her evidence with steady hands. Victor leaned back, arms crossed, eyes sharp with calculation. Eli whispered, "Don't shadowbox with him, speak to the paper," and she did. The reviewers traced every log, every checksum, every timestamp. Nora said, "The maintenance subnet was activated outside policy," and silence followed. Victor said, "Errors happen in complex systems," but the words felt thin. Patras confirmed the chain of custody like a brick layered into a wall. Nora's heart pounded, but her voice held flat calm. She said, "This record speaks without me." And the reviewers nodded. Eli said, "Stay grounded," and the ground seemed firmer than fear. The meeting ended without applause, but the tension smelled like iron and dust. Nora left knowing the truth had started to breathe. Afterward, Nora sat alone on a bench outside, the autumn air sharp with dried leaves and exhaust. Nora said they saw it, and her chest loosened. Eli joined her with 2 coffees and no ceremony. He said, "He'll push harder now," and she nodded because storms often return. Victor's allies whispered near the fountain, their glances carrying thin blades. Nora said, "I can't control their noise," and sipped her coffee slow. She remembered her mother's voice, steady even when rent was late. Eli said, "Noise fades, structure stays," and he tapped her folder. She tightened her coat, her breath fogging the air like a signal flare. Nora said, "If they smear me, let the evidence clean itself," and her words felt like steel. The city hummed around them, uncaring but present. The bench became an anchor, and she chose not to move until her heartbeat matched the rhythm of calm. By evening, Nora reviewed messages flooding her inbox, some supportive, some poisoned with doubt. A colleague wrote, "Don't get your hopes up," and it landed heavy. Nora said, "Doubt is their tool," and archived it without reply. Patras sent a quiet note, "I've confirmed the duplicate signature was fraudulent." Eli said, "That's leverage," and she breathed steadier. She typed her reply in clean, unadorned sentences, letting the evidence speak. Victor released a memo framing her as reckless, implying her investigation endangered workflows. Nora said, "He's choking on his own rope," and her tone was even. She printed his memo, marked contradictions, and logged them into her record. Eli said precision over passion, and she cut extra words until only bones remained. The night deepened, but her lamp cast a steady glow. Nora said, "I'm not the fire, I'm the stone it cannot burn," and her chest settled. The next morning, Victor cornered her in the corridor with a practiced smile. He said, "You're wasting your career on this," and his tone dripped honey and venom. Nora said, "A career without truth is ash," and walked past him without pause. He followed with a chuckle, meant for onlookers. Eli stepped out from a doorway, arms folded, and his silence drew a line. Victor muttered, "We'll see who lasts," and turned back toward his office. Nora's pulse raced, but her stride never faltered. She said, "He's louder because he's afraid," and the words steadied her spine. Eli said, "Don't fight in shadows, let the light do it," and she nodded. The fluorescent hum seemed less cruel than before. She entered her workspace and spread her documents across the desk like maps. Thorn pressed, but the walls of truth held. The air smelled of dust, ink, and resolve. That night, Nora walked home through streets glistening from rain, neon signs bleeding into puddles. She said, "Every lie is just breath," and exhaled into the cool dark. The evidence in her bag felt heavier than stone, but it was weight she chose. Eli texted, "Tomorrow, we bring Patris forward," and the thought steadied her. She remembered the mural of hands lifting the sun, and now the hands felt like hers. Nora said, "Truth isn't a torch, it's a mirror," and her reflection in the wet pavement agreed. Passing cars sprayed water, but she kept her stride calm. Street vendors packed up their carts, the smell of roasted corn lingering like comfort. She thought of her mother's tired smile and said, "This fight is larger than me," and the words warmed her chest. The night did not feel endless. It felt like preparation. She turned the corner and let the quiet carry her home. The review team reconvened, and the air in the glass chamber felt heavier than stone. Nora said, "This is my last submission," and placed a folder on the table with deliberate calm. Victor smirked, but his eyes darted once too quickly. Eli said, "Stay on the rails," and her pulse matched the rhythm. Patris entered with her own documentation, and the truth gained weight. Nora said, "These logs align with my findings," and Patris confirmed with steady authority. The reviewers leaned closer, pens scratching like rainfall. Victor said, "This is circumstantial," but the tremor in his tone betrayed cracks. Nora said, "Circumstance doesn't forge signatures," and the silence cut clean. Eli whispered, "Anchor," and she stood taller without effort. The chairperson said, "We'll deliberate further," and Nora exhaled only after the doors shut. She left knowing the fire had shifted from her to him. At lunch, Nora sat with Eli on the building's rooftop garden. The city spread like a restless ocean. Nora said, "He's cracking," and bit into a sandwich she barely tasted. Eli said, "Cracks widen when you stay steady," and his tone was iron wrapped in cloth. She remembered being 13, learning to fix a leaky faucet so her mother wouldn't worry. Nora said, "Survival taught me to patch leaks, but now I'm the hammer," and she laughed low. The skyline gleamed under a break in clouds, light refracting like promise. Eli said, "Truth scales differently. It multiplies when shared," and pointed at her notes. Nora folded her napkin, pressed it flat, and said, "I'll share with the full staff after deliberation." He nodded once, knowing her voice was no longer hiding. The rooftop smelled of wet soil and city wind. Nora said, "I won't shrink again," and the vow settled like cement. By afternoon, whispers crawled through the office corridors, some sharp, some soft. A colleague said, "She might actually win," and the tone was half awe, half dread. Nora walked past without bending, her eyes trained forward. Eli said, "Let their words trail, not lead," and she did. Victor's allies passed around a memo accusing her of arrogance. Nora said, "Confidence isn't arrogance, it's clarity," under her breath. Patris forwarded her evidence to an oversight board, widening the circle. Nora said, "Now the truth is bigger than me," and the thought steadied her. A junior analyst slipped her a note reading, "Thank you for standing up," and her chest tightened. Eli said, "That's why you fight," and she smiled for the first time that day. The building's hum no longer felt like a cage, it felt like a drum. She walked taller, carrying both weight and light. Evening shadows stretched long in the open plan office, as Nora spread her documents on a desk. Nora said, "I will publish this for the whole staff," and her voice carried certainty. Eli leaned against a cubicle wall, arms folded, watching her prepare. He said, "Once it's public, there's no walking back," and she nodded with no hesitation. Patris joined, placing her copies on the pile. Nora said, "Truth must breathe where everyone can see," and the statement felt like steel. She compiled her files into a clean packet for digital distribution. Victor lingered at the far end of the floor. His eyes narrowed, but he did not approach. Nora said, he's already lost the silence, and felt lighter. Eli said, then tomorrow is the turn, and the three shared a glance of unspoken resolve. The printer whirred steady, like a drum beat to an unfolding march. Night cloaked the city when Nora walked home with the packet in her bag, and a decision in her bones. Nora said, tomorrow, I publish, and the sentence was fire and stone together. Eli texted, history bends when someone holds the line, and she typed back, I'm holding. The street lamps stretched their halos across slick pavement, guiding her forward. She thought of her mother's tired but undefeated smile and whispered, I'll carry you into this. The evidence was ready, but so was she, and that mattered more. A gust of wind lifted her coat, and she did not clutch it closed, she let it fly. Nora said, no more hiding, and the words echoed inside her chest like bells. Cars hissed by, headlights cutting through the mist. The city did not cheer, but it bore silent witness. Tomorrow would demand everything, and she had already chosen to give it. Morning broke with a hard clarity, and Nora stood before her desk with the packet ready for release. Nora said, truth walks now, and clicked send to the entire company. Eli leaned against the doorway, silent but present. Notifications began to ping across the building like sparks on dry grass. Victor stormed into the hallway, his face tightened into stone. He said, you've crossed a line, but his voice quivered beneath the steel. Nora said, the line was already crossed when you forged, and her words landed sharp. Patras texted confirmation, your evidence has been received by the oversight board. Eli said, now the building belongs to light, and the hum of servers seemed to agree. The fear that once gnawed at her ribs had gone quiet. Nora said, let him rage. I won't, and her spine felt like tempered iron. The truth was no longer locked. It was living in every inbox. By mid-morning, the building swelled with chatter as the report spread. Colleagues clustered in corners, voices sharp with shock or awe. Nora walked through the center, each step a quiet defiance. A woman whispered, she stood up, and the words chased her like wind. Victor issued a public statement calling her reckless. Nora, said integrity, isn't recklessness, and walked past his office without slowing. Eli followed with his usual calm, scanning the reactions. Patras intercepted her with a nod and said, oversight already called, review underway. Nora felt the weight shifting, no longer crushing but carrying her forward. The silence that once suffocated, now listened. She said, if I fall it won't be in hiding, and the truth steadied her steps. The office lights glared bright, but she did not squint, she welcomed their heat. The official summons arrived by noon, an open hearing with senior leadership. Nora said, so the stage is set, and she felt her chest open, not tighten. Eli said, he'll come loud, you come steady, and she nodded once. Victor prepared with stacks of papers, his team buzzing like hornets. Nora said, noise can't erase signatures, and packed her evidence with measured calm. Patras slipped her a copy of the forged approval, highlighted in red. She said, this is the nail, and Nora breathed gratitude. The room they entered was wide, fluorescent lit, with leaders seated in rows like judges. Victor's opening was sharp, blaming her for division and instability. Nora said, instability begins when truth is bent, and her voice echoed clean. The air thickened, but she did not falter. Her words carried more weight than volume. The cross-examination hit hard, questions sharp as chisels, but Nora met each one with facts. She said, here is the log, and projected it without tremor. Victor leaned forward, trying to twist procedure into loopholes. Eli said quietly, don't chase, let them chase you, and she followed. Patras confirmed chain of custody under oath, her tone level as bedrock. Nora said, this record does not depend on belief. It is reproducible. And the room stilled. Victor slammed a chart, but his hand shook. Nora said, louder doesn't mean truer, and the chairperson's pen froze mid-air. The hearing stretched long, but every answer she gave built weight on her side. The lights buzzed overhead, harsh but steady, like they too were watching. She said, I stand because silence costs more than truth. And the line settled like stone. When the session ended, silence stretched long before anyone moved. The chairperson said, we will review and issue findings, and the sentence rang final. Victor gathered his papers with stiff hands, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Eli said, he's cornered, and she felt no triumph, only release. Patris pressed her shoulder once, firm and warm. Nora said, this isn't victory, it's unveiling, and the truth of it steadied her. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, light pouring down the glass facade. She stepped into it without flinching, letting the brightness mark her face. Eli said, whatever comes, you've already won the part that matters, and she nodded. The air smelled of rain, iron, and newness. Nora said, I didn't come to burn, I came to endure, and her chest felt unshackled. The day ended not with applause, but with clarity. The findings landed in the inboxes at dawn, and the headline cut through the company like a bell. Nora said, the board confirmed forgery, and her chest filled with both gravity and release. Victor's name sat in black and white, tied to misconduct and manipulation. Eli said, the light did the work, and his calm felt like an anchor. Patris texted one word, vindicated, and it rang like a hymn. Nora said, this isn't triumph, it's truth, and she let the words rest. Outside, the city hummed with indifference, but to her it sounded like balance restored. Colleagues walked past her desk, some offering nods, others silence, but none with accusation. She said, I carried the stone, and did not sink. And her hands no longer trembled. The office light seemed softer now, no longer interrogating, but affirming. Eli said, breathe it in, and she finally did. A long, steady breath. By mid-morning, Victor was escorted out with stiff shoulders, the silence heavier than any applause. Nora said, the system finally caught up, though her tone carried no glee. His allies turned away, unwilling to share his exit. Eli said, noise fades, consequence remains, and his words landed like stone. Patris crossed the floor, steady as ever, and offered Nora a nod of recognition. Nora said, I don't need his fall to stand, and the truth of it rang clear. Colleagues whispered less now, their eyes no longer cutting but curious. She thought of every moment she almost gave in to silence. Eli said, you outlasted the storm, and she felt the ground under her firm again. The air smelled of dust and paper, as if the building itself was lighter. Nora said, I will walk forward without carrying his shadow, and the corridor opened wide. At lunch, Nora sat outside under a pale sky, the city's noise a softer hum now. She unwrapped her sandwich slowly, no longer rushing through meals like survival drills. Eli said, you earned stillness, and his voice carried quiet pride. Patris joined, carrying her own lunch, and said, you didn't just protect yourself, you protected all of us. Nora said, that was always the point, and the words surprised her with their clarity. She thought of the mural of hands lifting the sun, and now she saw herself among them. The bench beneath her felt steadier than any desk. Eli said, your silence once kept you safe, but your voice kept us all, and she smiled softly. Nora said, the fight wasn't for applause, it was for air, and she finally felt free to breathe deeply. The breeze carried roasted nuts and street dust, reminding her she was still rooted here. That evening the company announced reforms, stricter audit trails, independent oversight, mandatory transparency. Nora said, let them build stronger walls, and her heart carried both caution and pride. Colleagues applauded the reforms in hushed tones, as if testing the air. Eli said, change is slow but it roots deep. And she nodded, feeling both the cost and gain. Patris emailed the staff, naming Nora's role without embellishment, calling it courage in practice. Nora said, courage is just standing when silence feels safer, and her words felt like stone carved clean. She didn't smile wide, but her eyes carried light. The office no longer felt like a cage, it felt like a place reshaped by endurance. Eli said, you left the ground different than you found it, And she accepted it, not as pride but responsibility. The reforms weren't hers alone, but they bore her imprint. Late at night, Nora walked home alone, the city hushed under dim street lamps. She said, "I am no longer unseen," and her words floated like smoke into the cool air. The mural of hands lifting the sun came into view, and this time, she stopped to look. Eli's voice replayed in her memory, "Your calm is loud," and she let the echo fill her. She touched the mural with her fingertips, paint rough beneath her skin. Nora said, "I will not vanish again," and her vow felt eternal. The night smelled of asphalt and faint flowers, resilience wrapped in concrete. Cars whispered by, and no shadow chased her now. She walked on, spine straight, carrying not just her truth, but the quiet strength of many. She said, "This is the beginning, not the end," and her voice was both steady and tender. The silence after carried her forward like music,